look at the evidence for evolution. Okay, some pieces of evidence include homologous body structures, similarities in embryology, similarities in DNA, vestigial structures, geographic distribution of living species, and of course the fossil record. So let's talk about homologous body structures. The word homologous means similarities. So we're looking at similarities in body structure. And you can compare basic body plans and how parts are arranged to tell how closely related organisms are, right? The more parts they have in common, the more closely related they are. If you look at fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, they all have a similar body structure, right? They all have an internal skeleton with a backbone. That means they all evolved from a shared common ancestor. If you look at this image, you can see that in each of these vertebrate limbs, there are a lot of similarities. Similarities in early development is talking about embryology, right? Similarities in these early embryos. Even though the adults can look very different, in the early developmental stages, they look very similar. Again, if you look at the turtle, the chicken, and a rat, they all have a tail, and they all have gill slits, which again implies that they all share a common ancestor. So here you can see this is the human embryo as it's developing. So at the earliest stages, it looks very similar to these other organisms. And it's not until that embryo is fully developed into a baby that you see a lot of these differences. Similarities in DNA. Okay, the more similar the DNA pattern, the more closely related the species. These two actually share quite a bit of DNA. Vestigial structures. These are structures that don't seem to have a function, but are body parts that once functioned in an ancestor. Okay, so both whales, snakes, and manatees as well all have a pelvic bone, although none of those organisms have legs. So once upon a time, they had something that fit into the pelvic bone, so probably, legs. Humans have an appendix. Okay, that's a vestigial structure that we don't use for anything. In a common ancestor, it would have served to help aid digestion. Also, humans have extra muscles around their ears. That would have been useful if we were trying to rotate our ears to hear better, but that's not something that humans are able to do. This is looking at that hip bone or pelvic bone that we had talked about. Right here it is in the whale and in snakes. So how fast does this evolution occur? And there are two theories. There's gradualism, which is the idea that evolution occurs slowly but steadily. So tiny changes in a species build up into major changes over very long periods of time. And this is what Darwin thought was the case with evolution. He thought change happened very slowly. But there's another theory called punctuated equilibria, which is this idea that species evolve during short periods of rapid change, but those periods of rapid change are separated by long periods of little or no change. So species could evolve very quickly when groups become isolated and adapt to their new environments. And it turns out that the answer is somewhere in between. The more that scientists study organisms and the more they study evolution, they realize that sometimes evolution occurs very slowly and other times it can happen very quickly. And again, we'll have talked about industrial melanism and the peppered moth. That is an example of evolution happening very quickly. Bacteria evolve very quickly. So those are just two examples of punctuated equilibria. Let's look at the fossil record. First of all, what is a fossil? A fossil is the preserved remains or traces of an organism that lived in the past. Fossils can be formed from bone, tooth, or shell, footprints, or worm burrows. So how do scientists determine a fossil's age? Well, there's two main ways. One is relative dating, the other is absolute dating. Now, in relative dating, they estimate the fossil's age compared with that of other fossils, right? So if you look at the layers of rock, you can assume the rocks on the bottom are the oldest, the ones on top are most recently formed. So you could say like this layer right here is younger than this layer, but older than this top layer. The downside is that it doesn't give you any specific information about that age in years. Absolute dating does give you a specific age in numbers. And absolute dating is performed by radioactive dating. That means you look at the remaining radioactive isotopes in a rock layer and determine the actual age of the rock or of the fossil. The main drawback is that part of that fossil is going to be destroyed during testing, because in order to test it, you actually have to grind the fossil down into tiny, tiny pieces before it's run through basically a machine that determines the number of radioactive isotopes that are remaining. Carbon-14 is the most common radioactive isotope used to find the age of fossils, of younger fossils, I should say, and that's because carbon-14, carbon is found in most life forms. So carbon-14 also has a short half-life that will mean more in class when we talk about it. So it's used for finding the age of relatively young things. So what do fossils reveal? Okay, the fossil record shows us a pretty good record of all of life on Earth. Okay, and it shows us, more importantly, that we've had a whole lot of species go extinct. Okay, we saw in an earlier video that there have been a large number of mass extinctions, that there have been 5 mass extinctions, and we're currently approaching a 6th mass extinction. To say a species is extinct means that it does not have any living members. Okay. In fact, almost all of the species preserved as fossils are now extinct. So most of what scientists know about extinct species is based on the fossil record. Fossils, as we've mentioned before, provide evidence that living things have evolved. They show a history of life on Earth and how different groups of organisms have changed over time. This is a fossil of Archaeopteryx, which would be relative to modern-day birds.